Okay, we're live.
3, 2, 1. This is Literary Roadhouse, one short story once a week. I'm Gerald.
I'm Anais.
And I'm Maya. Before we get started, I want to do a language warning. Sometimes we do get a little saucy on this program, so check the iTunes notes, check the notes on the website, and we'll let you know whether or not it's explicit or whether you can safely share it with children.
If you haven't read The Half-Skinned Steer by Annie Proulx and don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast, read the story, then come back. So, with this story, we open with Miro, who is telling us a tale of his life from his time in the 1930s on a ranch in Wyoming, as many of Annie Proulx's stories are set. Miro leaves the farm in 1936, leaving his father, his father's girlfriend, and his brother, intent on creating a new life for himself. He goes to war, and on his return, settles in Massachusetts. He marries 3 times, makes money in duct cleaning and boilers, and spends some time in local politics. He gets a call from his brother's daughter-in-law. His brother, Rollo, has died. Miro hasn't been in touch with his family for 60 years and didn't even know his brother had a son. He begins the journey by car from his home, across America, back to Wyoming. He uses the journey to reflect on his life and his family's history. On the journey, he makes mistakes and at one point wrecks his car. He buys another and continues his journey. The common thread running through the narrative is a tale told by his father's girlfriend just before Miro left home. The story concerns a man known to the girlfriend who has a galvanized metal plate in his head which was poisoning his brain. This man had paused during the skinning of a steer to rest and eat, and on returning the steer had got up and walked away, looking back at him with red, glaring eyes. As Miro approaches the farm for the funeral, the weather turns nasty and he struggles with the memories of the location of the farm and with the weather. As he gets stuck in the snow and resolves to walk to a nearby ranch, he notices cattle in a field next to the road, and amongst them, one steer, half-skinned, is watching him. That was
Ooh.
a long
Okay.
introduction. Sorry
Oh,
about
it was a dense story. So let's
that.
start just top level.
Mm.
How did everybody just enjoy the story? Not even a matter of like it. Did you enjoy your read?
I
Yes.
definitely did. I enjoyed it throughout, and like you said, dense. That's the first word that comes to mind. Like, what a dense story. I loved it.
Yeah.
Next.
How
Me
about,
too.
how about you, Gerald?
Yeah. I knew as soon as I read that first, because you open up these stories and you don't know what to expect. I hadn't read this before, and I read the first sentence and I sort of put the brakes on. I thought, no, you got to take your time with this one, Gerald. And yeah, really enjoyed it.
Interesting. I actually did not enjoy it the first time I read it. The second time I read it, I enjoyed it a lot more. I enjoyed it best when I listened to it on Audible. And also enjoyed it more after a third read than I did the first time around. I find it interesting that you enjoyed it, Gerald, because the problem I had with it is the problem you had last week with James Baldwin was the constant going in and out, and it was done in such a way that was very organic, but it was also done in such a way that I wasn't in it enough to stay with it, and so I was getting lost in the story. There were a couple points where I actually had to go back and reread portions just to figure out what was going on. I was a little confused by it the first time around, and it was because of the way the time shifts work for me. It just didn't click for me. And then the second read, it was much smoother. The time shifts, I was able to follow with the time shifts a lot more. And when I listened to it on Audible, I actually enjoyed it best on Audible, which I think is interesting because I think it's written almost like an oral tradition story. And I find a lot of oral stories are easier for me to listen to than they are for me to read on paper. And out loud, the story is much smoother and much more dramatic than when I read it on paper,
Yeah,
which makes me sound illiterate.
no, not at all. No, it's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Why did I like it? Um, yeah, those time shifts didn't bother me at all because I don't know. I was directly in the story. I was there,
Hmm.
and when he shifted, I shifted with him. I don't know. I was carried along with the story. Yeah, that's
Well, it makes
yeah,
sense to me
interesting
because
thought.
that's exactly how I felt last week. About
Yeah,
last week's story is as it shifted, I shifted with it. But this time, I just couldn't. She kept losing me, and I knew that it was such an important story and such an important writer that I gave it multiple reads. If this had been a new writer and I'd only read it one time, I might have discounted it. But then after reading it multiple times, I actually read some of her other work, and I actually really enjoy this writer quite a bit. So I found that whole experience, the reading experience as a whole, very interesting. How about you, Anais?
yeah, listening to you guys talk about the time shift, it's funny because for the most part, she didn't lose me with any of the time shifts, except one time. And even after I learned it the first time, I still got confused the second read. Like I forgot when the first time he's talking about the old man Rollo and the girlfriend in the kitchen telling the story, and then it says he thought about it and he's listening to it again as he's putting on his hat in the hallway. I'm like, wait, is Miro putting on his hat back in the 30s or now in the 90s? Both times that one confused me. Like I just was like slow to learn it. But other than that, I thought they were really smooth. That was the only one where I kind of stumbled.
Yeah,
Yeah, I stumbled a bit on that one too.
yeah. I think they were they seemed to be not signposted, but as soon as he shifted, I was right there. I don't know. I think it's just some sort of subtlety in how she wrote the story that as soon as she shifted, I was in the right place.
I think
It's yeah,
I was gonna say I
strange.
think it's funny you use the word signposting because that's one of my very first notes when I was sort of like meditating on the story is that this story has very little signposting, like
Hmm.
the rest.
Yeah, that was actually my problem with it is the lack of signposts.
Yeah, there's no
So,
signpost anywhere. Like even the dialogue, even when she writes a sentence, like so I was noticing that there's no real dialogue tags, kind of like Juno Diaz, which
mhm,
we read before on the podcast. But sometimes she
yeah,
writes a sentence that there's no reason why there shouldn't be dialogue tags. Like there's one's just, I'll keep an eye on it, he said. There's no reason there shouldn't be dialogue tags, other than she just won't do it because she just
yeah,
doesn't.
it's a stylistic decision.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually find that style interesting. There's a couple writers that do it. I've seen it done badly, but the lack of dialogue tags, I actually felt like she did them really well in the story.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, might maybe even better than Juno Diaz, but actually, his lack of dialogue tags didn't bother me there either. I think he did it pretty masterfully as well. But I've seen some amateur stories written where I was like, no, 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 no. You aren't good enough to get that to get that leeway. like back up.
Hmm.
But yeah, I found her lack of dialogue tags interesting, but not as bothersome as the lack of time shift tags. I think the time shift tags work if you're really, really into the story. But if for any reason you're not like right there, then they can be very confusing to a reader. Because like I said, I read it multiple times. And on further reads, no problem. But the first read really lost me, and I was reading it fairly slowly.
Hmm.
There were also a couple points at Annie's, where you said you got a little hiccup.
Hmm.
I actually stopped reading and didn't come back to the story for several hours, which doesn't normally happen to me for short stories. Usually I start a short story and I read it all the way through. So what I would say is that this story is one of those stories that, at least for some readers, is probably a completely different story on multiple reads.
Hmm. Yeah, and maybe because as soon as I read the first sentence, I I stopped and as I said, put the
Yeah.
brakes on. So I read the story a lot more slowly than I would normally read. So maybe that's why I
Mhm.
kept up with the shifts and all the sort of intricacies of the style, lack of dialogue tags and stuff like that. So maybe I was with it a lot more than James Baldwin last read.
Exactly. And
Mm.
I think that's something for our listeners to be aware of, because this is a very interesting story. It's it's a very important story in the history of short fiction, and she's a very important writer. And so when you approach the story, just make sure that you don't approach the story like you're approaching something that's quick and easy to read, even though it's modern, even though it's Midwest. I would probably read it more like you were reading like Garcia Marquez or something. Like, read it more closely, read it more slowly, maybe even read it a second time, because you'll enjoy it a lot more if you slow down than if you read it like you're just reading any other modern short story, because it really isn't a normal modern short story. Let's talk a little bit about the symbolism and just the core meaning of the story. What did you guys get out of the story as you read it?
Do you want?
Gerald looks like he has something to say. Let's start with
It's on the tip
Gerald.
of his tongue. That's why I'm not cutting him off.
I know. He just looks so anticipating. He's like, I want to go. I want to go. I want to go.
No,
it's okay, Gerald. You can go.
I was going because I've talked enough, but I thought I was going to give Anais a chance.
I just
But
love
since
it when
you've
you
got-
gush over stories, though, because we've been forcing you to read a lot of stuff you don't like, and when you really like a story, it makes me happy.
Yeah, I mean, like some other stories that we've read. This is a coming home story after where 60 years. So much has changed. So much is different, and in well, yeah, we can do spoilers. He doesn't actually get home, so it's a sort of it's a real you can't go back type thing. It's you try to go back and you're going to die, and and also what did I say? And yeah, the revenge. I think it's sort of revenge, sort of once removed sort of thing, because this he gets his revenge on Miro, but I just loved so much about it.
It's funny you say revenge. I didn't quite pick up on revenge, but there is something. There's a little. I want to get back to that because there's like a corollary to that. But going to the theme, I like sort of the theme of unfinished business and how it's going to call you back, or you feel like inevitably you have to go back to finish it. Like Tin Head goes back to finish skinning the steer, and this guy, he just up and left before he was really done with the ranch. He goes out to Massachusetts. Well, he travels before he even gets there, but he's inevitably going to come back, and he knows that. And but there's also futility to it, where it's like when your number's up, your number's up. Like, it's almost like he waited too long, Like, here's the unfinished business, and it's waiting for him. That right, you have the half-skinned steer staring for him when that final line where he wasn't waiting for Tin Head, it was waiting for Miro. It's like he's the one who had to go back and finish everything, but at the end of the day, life's not waiting for you. Like, right, it's a very harsh environment. Everything about the ranch, it's dry, it's red. It reminded me of To Build a Fire a little bit with Jack London.
Mm-hmm.
Oh
yeah, there was a little bit of that. Yeah,
I kept being reminded of it because there was even that sort of that as his body is breaking down, his mind is breaking down, and he makes more mistakes. I'm like, this is just like the guy in To Build a Fire. They even die similarly.
Yeah.
It's interesting because after reading it multiple times, the thread of revenge is brought up a lot in the literary analysis of this story. But for me, it was, I wouldn't say, it didn't feel like so much a revenge story as a karma story, like a generational karma. When Tin Head looks back at the half-skinned steer, he doesn't just say, like, he's cursed. He's cursed, his family's cursed, his children are cursed, the dog is cursed, everybody's cursed from that steer. And I think what the story is talking about is the curse of who you come from. So this guy's life, he's spent it getting as far away from his roots as possible, not just as far as not visiting his family, but even going so far as to turn vegetarian and to, like, exercise a ton and, like, be as opposite as possible from his roots. And in the end, you are who you are, and the curse is going to follow you regardless of how much you fight against it. And as a Buddhist, like, that was just a really strong, like, karmic idea, and I have a huge interest in, like, generational memory and stuff. And so I was reading the story a little bit differently. And for me, that was like a really, really potent symbolism, because he's literally worked his entire life to be as far removed from his family as possible. And then when he comes back, the minute he comes back, that curse is just waiting for him, and it's not going to let him go. And you know he's going to die, because, like, it's just, there's so much foreboding in the second half of that story. You know he's not going to make it to that house. And it's just like, wow, you know, you've done all this work. He's never had an accident until he's on his way back home. Like, it's just, wow, you know, it was really, really intensely foreboding for a really long time. And there's something very universal in that. I think a lot of times as young people in our 20s, we think we're not going to be our parents. We're going to be so different from our parents. And then we have kids, and like 20 years later, you're like, oh my God, did mom just come out of my mouth? And it's one of those things, you know, because it's like where he comes from, yeah, he lives on this ranch, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. But like the whole thing with the girlfriend and they're all screwing her. Okay, there goes our language warning. You know, and how she's talked about, and it's all like in a very like brutal, flesh, bloody way that this environment is described. And then he goes from that to eating a pear and 6 cloves of garlic every morning and exercising like crazy and being this 83-year-old man with muscles, you know, and it's like this whole, I'm going to not be them. And then in the end, he is who he is.
And there was also 3 other places where that sort of generational cycle curse, it comes up again. Early on when he talked about how the old man became a mailman, and they just want him to move out with the girlfriend so that they can kind of take up what their grandmother Olive had done after Jacob Corn ran out on her. Then she worked the ranch. So he's already thinking early on in the story when he's younger in that generational way. And then there's this one sentence that I thought was brilliant where it talks about like the way that the ranch kind of boomerangs through a whole bunch of different ownership and comes back to the Corns. It goes to the Girl Scouts, and then it goes to the Banner Ranch, then it goes to the Australian businessman who hires the Idaho guy to run the Australian safari, but then the Idaho guy is not very good at it, so it comes back to Rollo. Like, there's, in one sentence, there's kind of like this inevitability that is going to keep coming back to this family. And what you were saying about him kind of like trying to prove he's not like them, that one of my favorite moments in the story is when he's having the conversation with his brother's daughter-in-law, and she's there like, oh yeah, I tried to beat it with a cane. He wanted you to see how well he's done. And I feel like, to me, Miro was like a little resentful that his family wasn't bankrupt and ruined like he expected in the very first paragraph. The very first paragraph, he's like, oh, he never went back to go see them be bankrupt and ruined. Then he gets this call, and they're like, no, they were doing pretty well for themselves, and they wanted you to see it. And he has that moment where he's like, I could probably have fought off an emu. Like, he's constantly trying to make himself a little better. He's like, I can buy, or like he's just like,
I got some
Cadillac. Yeah, I'm gonna drive there in my caddy.
Good spot, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and when he gets a new caddy and he doesn't like the way it rides, he's like, oh, I'll get another one on the way back because I can do whatever I want.
Exactly. He has this thing where it's like, I'm not bankrupt and ruined, they are. But he's like terrified to call and find out that they aren't ruined because he wants them to be ruined.
Yeah, because otherwise, what reason did he have for leaving?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, and I didn't really pick up the sort of unfinished business thing until you just mentioned it, and then I thought, yeah, he gets this call about his brother's funeral, and he ups and goes straight away. He doesn't make excuses or doesn't sort of think, oh, you know, shall I or shan't I? He just ups and goes. So he is drawn back. I think he's and he does want to see for himself what the ranch is like, and yeah, I guess he's hoping it would be, you know, it would be all wreck and ruins.
It's like the old-timey version of going to your ex's Facebook. This is, you know, you're like, I wanted you to be.
Anais, I can't believe you just drew that to comparison. That's so funny.
I need to bring it in for like our 2 millennials.
Oh man, that was great. That was a great metaphor. So, how did we all feel about the language of the story?
Loved it. It's, you know.
What did you like about it?
It's just straight away. It's fulsome. It's simple in a way. It's straightforward. There's There's nothing too fancy about it, but it is packed full of description of of symbolism of everything. Sorry, I liked it.
I think it's funny you said it's
I
not fancy. I thought it was very fancy.
Yeah.
In a not in the sense that it's like lyrical,
In an approachable way. It wasn't fancy in a way that left you hanging.
but the descriptions like describing limestone as folded laundry, mountains darkened by a millennia of raptor feces. Like this is some very high, like poetic, lyrical stuff, but it's like a masculine kind of voice.
Hmm.
Like I had to remind myself it's a female author because it read so, because it's so rough. Like that's the intention, I think.
Yeah, she does male protagonists really, really well. I totally agree with you. One thing I noticed, and which may be where Gerald's coming from, is a lot of the high-end metaphors use very base language.
Mhm.
So, like in language theory, you've got like your Latin words, and then you've got your Germanic words, and your Germanic words are little. It's the difference between, sexuality and I'm trying to be clean. Like you have your Latin words are all like flowery and pretty and a little bit longer and a little more syllables, and then your Germanic words are like shorter and a little more coarse. And in English, a lot of our more coarse words are actually Germanic origin words. And you find that in academia, they tend to use a lot more Latinate words. Words get longer and more flowery. And I found that while she used really advanced metaphor, like the words in the metaphors were often very simple and coarser, which made it feel very masculine. In particular, I loved how the girlfriend is described. It's very sexist, it's very coarse, it's very bloody and meaty and like earthy description of this woman, in a way that I haven't seen in any writer, but especially from a female writer. I think if a male writer had written that, they might have had a harder time getting away with it. But she was able to write it in such a way that like I could see this woman, and like she oozes sexuality and just animalistic nature, and it was a little gross, and not gross in a nasty way, but gross as in a dramatic like very just coarse way. As far as the language is concerned, I loved everything about that section. I was a little confused whether they were all doing her or just the dad and the other two were thinking about it. Like, there was something going on there that was a little gross in the other way too. But yeah, it made it very, very masculine feeling. And I found in her other stories, she again does masculine stories very well. She's the woman that wrote Brokeback Mountain.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny you were saying about, because I was just looking back on the document now, and you were saying I particularly like the part where you described the girlfriend, and that's what I was just looking at. There's sort of several highlighted bits there because she see, I'm calling Annie Proulx a he because it's so much like a male writer. But she refers to the girlfriend as a horse, and it's horse all the time, horse all the time, and she says what he wondered was if Rollo had got the girlfriend away from the old man, thrown a saddle on her, and ridden off into the sunset. There's this
Yes.
sort of horse thing going on all the time. It's really funny.
Or the haunches, how her butt is described as haunches, and you just want to smack them. Like, that was just really...
Yeah.
That's a case where when you're writing, if you're going to go there, you just got to go there. And she just went there. There was no pulling back. Like, she rode that metaphor right off the edge. And I really appreciated that about the story.
Mm-hmm. And it did a good job of conveying, when the old man is in the room, everyone's like on edge and super tense. He leaves for like 2 seconds to go outside to do something, and everyone's like more relaxed. He comes back in, the tension's there, like the power that one very important figure can have on a room, capturing that without being like, you had an important power on the room. Just like the way that she describes it is so effective.
And I also like how, I think they says it twice, or maybe he only says it once and it just made such an impact during that portion when he's like, either he didn't notice or he didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
And the power of the ability to not care is very potent to me. Like, if you're a man in that position and you just don't care, that says to me that you actually have power over everyone in that room.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because you have the power to not feel jealous and to just not give at all.
Yeah, when you're saying, I mean, coming back to language, and I said that it was simple language, and another part I highlighted when he was buying his car after he crashed his first car, and he said he'd gone to the vehicle place where lax salesmen drifted like disorbited satellites, and you just know exactly what she means, and you can see it. You can see these salesmen drifting around, and
Mm-hmm.
it's that sort of thing that I loved. It's it's just simple words, but it's so beautifully put together.
Yeah, she's an amazing writer, I must say. It's one of those situations where sometimes you just don't like a story. Sometimes you don't like a story, but you can tell that it's an amazing writer, and you're willing to give that story a second chance. And I definitely had that feeling throughout, even the first read, that I was missing something, rather than a feeling of I don't like the story. It was definitely a feeling of I'm missing something. And I trusted the writer enough to go back and reread it. And my trust was rewarded. And a lot of writers, a lot of stories, that's not the case. You miss something, you reread it, and it's just you hate it just as much on the second and third time around as you did on the first time around. And that was not the experience. And I think what made me trust her is her use of language. Her use of language was so masterful that I wanted to give the story a second chance.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we want to go next on here?
I don't know. I just have a random anecdote, as I do. Tent Sleep, by the way, it's a real town in Wyoming. In 2013, according to a consensus, it had 257 people. It was just tiny, and the Girl Scout anecdote was completely real. I don't know. Like, I was wondering like how much what's real. There is no Wyoming down under, though. I was disappointed. But like,
you ready to go visit, huh?
Yeah, I was like. I mean, it must be some sort of animal cruelty, but like putting a kangaroo in Wyoming. But
what's funny is we've been reading so many international stories that it took me 2 pages to decide that yes, this was in Wyoming. For a while there, I thought it was in South Africa. I'm like, where is this? We've got lions. What kind of lions? Mountain lions? Lions? And Tinsley, there is also a Tinsley in South Africa. So I was like, okay, where's the story? And it took me, learning more about the character to decide, okay, this is Wyoming.
real Wyoming.
I actually don't know much about Proulx. Did she grow up there?
I have no idea, but she has an entire book of short stories that is called Wyoming Stories.
So I'm guessing because it's just there's so many things that it felt like.
And they're amazing. They're all amazing, and they all have things like this. I was listening to another one of her stories, and these women were talking about their problems with men, and how all the men are trouble. And there was a line in there where if it has 4 wheels or a dick, you're going to have trouble with it. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, whoa. It was so awesome. And you could just hear these women that are just weathered by the environment, and they're just so blunt and just willing to just tell the truth like it is. And her stories are really, really full of that.
Mm-hmm.
I take exception to that. I never have trouble with my cars.
You don't have trouble with your cars. Did you catch that, Anais?
Gerald out of nowhere.
Just boom.
I was gonna also say.
Oh man!
Since you did the boom boom, there was that one moment of humor where Muriel's like 12 and he opens the book to look up what a vulva is. After the anthropologist is like, these are vulvas on the wall, and then there's the cymbal crash, like this one joke.
Oh man, that brought back so many memories because my mom had a huge encyclopedia collection, Okay, I'm dating myself. So encyclopedias were a series of books, often like 20 some odd books, and each book was represented a portion of the alphabet for all of our
National
millennial
Museum, I'm
years. And
aware.
so if you wanted to, yeah, if you wanted to look something up, you had to go look it up in the encyclopedia. And so like I spent so many hours when Mom was at work laying on the floor looking up bad words in the encyclopedia. You know, that's the first time you're like, that's what it looks like. Oh, never mind.
And did you go through the encyclopedia? Which word can I look up now? all these words you've heard at school that you have no idea what they are.
And you know what? Sometimes you would look up a word that was completely innocuous, but then there would be words in it that you had to look up, and it would lead you down this trail. Oh, those were the days.
Oh, yes. Yeah, when they take the anthropologist up to look at these cave drawing things, and he said that's the son, said the anthropologist, who resembled an unfinished drawing himself. I just thought that's lovely description.
Yeah,
I do like her writing.
I started doing a bunch of Google image searches for the Wyoming petroglyphs, and I was like, I want to find these vulvas. I didn't find it though. I was very disappointed.
Got you on a road map or what?
I was like, is it real?
that was the beauty of encyclopedias, because an encyclopedia would have had it. Oh man. So yeah, I think, you know, the story has so many amazing qualities. I think this is one of those stories that I really, really, really want our listeners to read. Like, we've read a lot of great stories, and even though I was very conflicted by the story at first, I feel like this is a must-read story. It's just so important, and there's so much symbolism in it, and it's quite amazing. Did any of you guys take a look at the symbolism of magical bulls? It's the steer, the magical steer. It's actually a retelling of an Icelandic story where there was a folktale where a magician skinned a steer. For the most part, there was still, like, the hide was still connected to the steer, and he would carry ghosts from up and down the river on the sled of bloody skin. And so that's where the half skinned steer comes from. But throughout mythology, steers have had a really strong magical quality, going back to the Greeks and Minos, and you know, it's a very core symbol, and it's something that lends the story really well to multiple readings and more research. You know, it's nice when stories have multiple dimensions like that, because then you can really dig your teeth into them, and this is definitely one of those stories that allows you to do that, because she pulls up a lot of old symbolism that I had no idea, and I wasn't making those connections until I started doing more research into the story. I was like, oh, this is really interesting. So where do we want to go from here? You guys ready to rate this puppy?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to let you guys go first, because I'm still not sure what to rate it.
Me neither.
Even after all this talking, I'm just so torn, because it did take me so many readings, but the language is so rich. I'm really, really torn on how to rate the story.
5.5 for me.
See, there was no hesitation in Gerald. I knew he was just going to help us out there.
I'm actually torn between a 5.5 and a 6, only because I feel like, can I give back-to-back 6s? What does this say about me? That I like grim American stories?
Yes, you like grim American stories, Anais. It's okay. You can give back-to-back 6s. You'll be forgiven.
I don't. There's nothing I didn't like about it. It was so good.
Hey, you had that hiccup, though. You had that hiccup.
Yeah, but like, that's on me. You know, like, I don't know if I can blame the author every time. I mean, I didn't even learn the second time around. Like, clearly there's a deficiency in me. Yeah, I think I'm gonna give it a 6. It's so good.
Whoa. I think for me,
Yeah.
I missed a 6 because it didn't. It's a great story, beautifully written, but it didn't quite have that sort of, you know, it's not staying with me, and I think, you know, to get a 6 for me, it has to sort of resonate and keep thinking about it. But anyway, That's just me.
I think for me, if I had done it after the first read, it would have seriously been like a 2 or a 3. But after multiple reads and after really recognizing the depth, I wanted to bump it up a little bit. But then the fact that the story made me go on and start reading her other work, I feel like that is a huge sign. Because that's happened a handful of times. But it hasn't happened where I immediately started reading their work. So that tells me that there was something about the story that was sticking with me. So I'm gonna give it a 4.5. I'm gonna go ahead and give it a 4.5. For me, like I feel like I have to ding it because I did have to read it multiple times to learn to enjoy it. Like I had to learn how to read her. So I can't give it a 5, but I want to get it as close to a 5 as possible because the fact is the language is amazing. It made me go on and read her further work. It made me want to look into the symbolism of the bull. And that's all like really, really high praise for a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's still only 5. It's no 4.5.
Yeah, 4.5. Yeah.
You're harsh.
I am harsh, but that's just because for me 5s are like huge. Like for me 5s are like some people's 6s. Like to get a 6, it has to be literally like perfect. So yeah, I feel like 4.5 is like a good rating.
Mm-hmm. So I think we've had really good stories back to back because listeners gave Sunny's Blues by James Baldwin a 5.5 because it's so good.
Wow.
Very good.
Yeah, it was so good. Wow, that story was so good. So,
Okay.
What are we going to be submitting for this week, Anais?
I'm submitting Wagons Ho by Paget Powell.
And I have decided that it's time we start delving into a little bit of literary science fiction here, so I am submitting Bloodchild by Octavia Butler.
I love that story. I want you to win.
Did you just have a moment? Do you need a room?
I do. Actually, I've been wanting to get a different Octavia Butler story on this podcast for a while, but I can't get a free version of it online. Actually, I did find one, but it was a butt. Yeah, because I've read that whole
anthology. That's hard.
Oh, so good. Anyway. But yes, that's
Calm down. Okay, so we have to play a game, and I have 2 games this week. I don't know which to choose. Do you want the word game, or do you want the guessing game?
Guessing.
Okay.
Well, that was easy.
Yeah, easy peasy. Okay, it's still got a relationship to words, but you have to guess how many meanings the following words have according to the Oxford English Dictionary.
I love you, Gerald. That's awesome.
I said it was a guessing game. Well, no,
that's great. And how's this work? High, low, like get as close to it without getting over?
Yeah, you have to get as close to it as you can. So.
Okay.
So we'll just have a few, and the numbers are all in excess of 100. So that's all I'm telling you. So
so you're going with the full OED, not like the reference, the OED reference.
Yeah, the proper OED. Okay.
Neither one of us.
I love the OED. I love the OED. It's such a great book.
Okay. So firstly, Anais, you can go first. Mm-hmm. How many meanings does the word strike have?
And it's in excess of 100.
It's in excess of 100. Strike.
But less than 200?
I'm not going to say any more.
I don't know. 116? I don't know.
Okay. And Maya?
157.
Maya's closest. The answer is 250.
What?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I know this is crazy, isn't it? Right, Maya, you can go first this time. How many meanings does the word set have? S-E-T.
128.
Okay. And Anais?
150.
You're closest, but not by much. 464.
What? I was going to
Oh,
get 300s, and I was like, that's insane.
bonkers, isn't it? Okay. So that's one each. Okay. Anais, your turn first.
Mm-hmm.
How many meanings does the word fall have? F-A-L-L.
Or like 500.
Okay. And Maya?
215.
Oh, well done, Maya. It is actually 264.
Really?
Mm.
I use fall in 500 ways, personally.
Yeah.
Two ways.
Okay. And right, the word stand. Maya, you go first.
320.
Okay. And Anais?
260.
And Maya is closest at 334. And I'm going to end the game there.
Yeah, Maya. Yay, I'm so excited.
Is it a fix? No, of course not. But
No, I actually like dictionaries. I have a thing about dictionaries. I have like 8 of them in my house, and I look through them for fun.
wow, that's an admission.
I'm sorry. And the one thing that's going to be hardest when I travel is not taking my Oxford English dictionaries with me.
It's online, so you're okay.
I'm a dork. So we are going to be reading Blood Child by Octavia Butler.
Excellent.
Yay, I'm so excited for that. So, what did you think of The Half-Skin Steer? Please join our discussion in the comments section at literaryroadhouse.com. And while you're there, leave an iTunes, Stitcher, or Spreaker review. And if you enjoy our show, tell your friends. Until next time, read a good story.